everybody on this beautiful, beautiful rainy day we have here.
Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Steve.
Hey guys, let's go.
We only have to start on time on these days because we're on live stream, so that's why we start on. We're going to start off by singing "Near the Cross." This is an old classic. One of Chris's favorite hymns. So we're going to sing it. Anybody know these glasses? Did I miss a pair of glasses?
I can't see the seat. I'm just kidding.
I'll sell them to the highest bidder.
They look familiar, but they're too dirty. They wouldn't be mine. Oh.
Now nobody's been playing with me.
And now, what about this beach towel?
Oh, that's
Jackie
cute.
said it was, some of the food was delivered a couple weeks ago for a meal we had here, Valentine's luncheon, and a beach towel, and nobody's claiming it.
That's yours, Steve.
Okay.
Put it back there with the baptistry. People will appreciate it.
All right. So, when you walked in, that's where the music and the three-hole punch Bible study will be.
Did you do that?
I did.
Oh, you're so good.
And then the silent sheet for the soup and salad day. I can also send that around if you want to do that. But the question for today, and also remember, that's on March 16th, and then on April 30th is the play over at Regents. It's a hilarious musical. You're going to love it, so I hope y'all can go to that. It's called Smoke on the Mountain. Okay, so the question today is, there's an old song, not a hymn, but it's one of those folk songs you sing around the fire and stuff. This land is your land, this land is your land. Okay, so can you tell me what year it was written?
Oh my God.
1 year it was written. You get one guess.
35.
No.
65.
No, somewhere in between 35 and 65.
Oh, that 58.
48.
Less than 58.
46.
You gotta raise your hand.
56.
56, nope. Nope. Lower than 45. Rudy,
Lower than 45.
you can only get one guess.
Oh.
Nope.
43.
Yolanda.
1941.
Nope.
40.
1940.
Who said 40?
Oh.
But somebody didn't raise their hand, but I'll still give you.
1940! That was gonna be my second.
Do you know who wrote it? Do you know who wrote it?
You.
I'm about to.
Sometimes you turn one about this one and then
Okay,
Woody Guthrie.
yes. That's right.
You gotta be quicker.
I wasn't giving her anyway. So, all right, Donna. Stand-up comic Donna.
Okay, well, I picked on blondes, I picked on old people, so this is something that I had read about children, but there's several jokes here just about kids. Okay, property laws of a toddler, you've probably heard this before. If I like it, it's mine. If it's in my hand, it's mine. If you take it from me, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it is mine, it should never appear to be yours in any way. If I am building or doing something, all the pieces are mine. If it looks like mine, it's mine. If I saw it first, it's mine. If you are playing with something and you put it down, it automatically becomes mine. If it is broken, it's yours. Okay. Two little boys are going to the hospital the next day for an operation. Theirs will be the first on the schedule. The older boy leans over and asks, "What are you having done?" The second boy said, "I'm getting my tonsils out and I'm afraid." The first boy said, "You've got nothing to worry about. I had them done when I was 4. They put you to sleep, and when you wake up, they give you lots of Jell-O and ice cream. It's a breeze." The second boy then asked, "What are you going in for?" The first boy said, "Circumcision."
Oh dear.
"Wow," the smaller boy replied. "Good luck, buddy. I had that done when I was born and I couldn't walk for a year."
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
A 3-year-old boy went with his dad to see a litter of kittens. He returned home. He breathlessly informed his mother, "There are 2 boy kittens and 2 girl kittens." "How do you know?" his mother asked. "Daddy picked them up, looked underneath," he replied. "I think it was printed on the bottom." Another 3-year-old put his shoes on by himself. His mother noticed that the left shoe was on the right foot. She said, "Son, your shoes are on the wrong feet." He looked up at his mother with a raised eyebrow and said, "Don't kid me, Mom. These are the only feet I've got." Anyway, laugh even, it's not funny. Thank you. Okay, on the first day of school, about mid-morning, the kindergarten teacher said, "If anyone has to go to the bathroom, hold up 2 fingers." A little voice from the back of the room asked, "And how does that help?" Oh, enough of these subjects. When I read this, it kind of reminded me of Saul and how bad he treated David. But let me read this to you, because we have a problem of forgiving people when they do and say things to us that are just not nice. It said, "It took me a long time to understand what it means to forgive someone. I always wonder how I could forgive someone who chose to hurt me. But after a lot of soul searching, I realized that forgiveness isn't about accepting or excusing their behavior. It's about letting it go and preventing their behavior from destroying your heart."
There you go.
Yeah, the humor today had a little, like a British dry style to it. And so I like that. I like the variety that we had there. That was good. The first one with the the rules for property rights of a toddler, I was like, that's pretty much how I feel all the time still. So I don't know if I've grown up so much from that time in my life, but
You can answer that.
and you can let my wife answer that. She can probably be honest with you about it. But yeah, very appropriate thought at the very end there too, because not only does that tie back to what we talked about last week, which was the most subtle temptation that we face in life, and that is the desire to get even, to get revenge, if you will. Because we talked about how it's part of our nature, because we're created in God's image to desire justice. And along with that desire for justice is sometimes the desire for us to make justice happen ourselves. And that's not something that God has allowed to us. And so we saw a pretty extreme example of that in David's life with Saul last week. And we saw how he came out to the good as a result of that interaction, though he was tempted, like all of us would be in the same circumstance. Probably haven't been in the same circumstances when David was in that situation last week. But if we're in these types of opportunities where it's easy for us to sometimes take vengeance on other people, and especially if other people agree with us that it's the right thing to do, it makes it very hard to resist, especially when the emotions are there. And so this week is really about those emotions that can push us over the edge as well. So we're going to look all into 1 Samuel 25, and we're going to read most of the verses that are in that. So we're going to have a pretty packed lesson time today. Hopefully everybody's got blanks to fill in if you're interested in doing so. We got a full front and back page amount of content that's there that I want us to look at. So last week we talked about the desire for getting revenge, and this week kind of goes along with that with what can be a motivating emotion towards that, and that is anger, which is one of the most dangerous and debilitating emotions that we can experience. Oh, I thought that was like a tornado horn. I was like,
Hit the floor.
that's right. We have an anger alarm going on. Anger is one of the most dangerous, debilitating emotions that we can experience. Anger is something that can creep up onto us before we even know it. It can wear a lot of different faces. We talked a little bit last week about how when you think about something, if the temptation is there, it's like a bird lighting on your head. The giving into that temptation, at least in the mind, is when we let it dwell on our mind. Let the bird build the nest. Anger is the same way. There can be maybe a flash of anger that happens when someone does something to you, or you feel like something should be different. And it can come in a mild form, but could escalate from there very quickly. And it can wear different faces: irritation, harsh word, hostile actions against one another. And that's when it can become dangerous if we let it become a habit. So anger is a choice, that's a blank there, that can easily become a habit. I don't know if you've experienced this before, but let's say first thing in the morning, they call it getting off on the wrong side of the bed, or getting off the wrong side of the bed when you wake up. Something happens and it kind of sets you off, and then that kind of sets your trajectory for the rest of the day, because you've been irritated maybe by something minor early on, and then every little thing that comes along, you've noticed the negative over the positive, and it can lead to a whole bad day, bad weeks. It could lead to relationships that can fracture sometimes because of things that just escalate from very small beginnings. And that small beginning is a choice on how you respond to your environment or things that may happen to you along the way. And if you give in to responding negatively to things, there's a habit that forms in doing that, right? So the way we look at life can be formed by how we respond to these choices that we make day in and day out, on whether or not we're going to become angry at certain things. Anger can become a form of insanity. Insanity in the sense that you lose control, right, of yourself. You can't control your behavior once you get to a certain point. And so when you think of someone who is insane, that's someone who generally has lost perspective enough or self-control, so that they aren't reacting properly to the environment that they're in. Well, anger can create that in any sane person, just by causing us to escalate to a certain point. So, we're going to be a little surprised, I think, at how much this particular emotion is going to affect the man of the hour or the month, which is David. And so David's the guy that we just talked about last week, who patiently endured Saul for so long, all these attempts on his life, and even had that opportunity to take Saul's life and chose not to, and even felt bad about how he treated Saul when he even spared his life. Well, this week we're going to see this hero, for a period of time, pretty much go close to insane with anger. So here's the background on 1 Samuel 25. In those days, shepherds were usually employed by men who owned sheep and were wealthy. Okay, so if you were a shepherd, most shepherds didn't own the sheep that they shepherded. They were hired hands to watch over. This is why Jesus talks about, I'm the good shepherd over the sheep. I know my sheep know me. He talks about being a shepherd who owns the sheep or has a relationship with the sheep. And then he contrasts that with those who are hired hands. And he says the hired hands just kind of run when the wolves come. So that's the context that we see here. Shepherds generally aren't as concerned about the sheep because they're not the ones who own the sheep. And so this story, the basic setup of this, it has to do with employer-employee relationships. Basically, David is the employee in this situation, and he plans to kill his boss. Not the boss you're thinking of, because we've been talking so much about Saul. This is someone else. Now we know Saul right now is still acting as the king, and he's off doing some official battles for Israel. All right, so he's fighting enemies. He's not necessarily in the picture for 1 Samuel 25. This is a scenario that David finds himself in, separate from Saul. So David is, at this time, with his 600 merry men who are behind the scenes fighting various wild tribes in the wilderness of Paran. So this is the situation they're in, where David, with these people that he met in the caves in the wilderness when he was running from Saul, they've kind of gathered around and they have become this mercenary force that picks up gigs in fighting, and in doing so, that's how they survive. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So they're protecting shepherds from sudden attack. Shepherds. So David and these 600 fighting men are wandering around this area in Paran where there are a lot of shepherds, and they are protecting them from attacks from outside forces. Now, according to the custom in that time, that was a typical thing for people to do who didn't have employment. These mercenary armies were around for those purposes, and especially during the time of the year when the sheep were sheared. And typically when that happened, the owner would set aside a certain amount of profits that they'd make off of shearing the sheep to pay for those who were around protecting the shepherds and the sheep. Now, there's no law saying that people had to pay people who did this, but it was more like tipping a waiter. It was just kind of an expectation. And so David and his men, they've been faithfully watching out for the sheep of a man named Nabal, N-A-B-A-L. And now payday's going to roll around. Nabal is one of the blanks.
You filled it in already.
You filled it in.
Oh, I already did?
Yeah, you filled it in for us.
There's a freebie.
Thank you.
There you go.
The trick.
That's right. I'll be expecting a tip later. Sheep shearing time. See what I did there? Okay, so when payday rolls around, Nabal doesn't want to pay up. All right, so that's what we're going to see here. 1 Samuel 25. These are the characters in the story identified for the first 3 verses. Samuel died. Who's Samuel? What's that? What's that? Yes, Samuel was the prophet who sought David out in his home, in his father's home, Jesse, and was called by God to anoint David. So he's the one who originally anointed him. He's also the one a little bit later on that David ran to first when Saul was out to get him. And Samuel couldn't hide him successfully. So they weren't able to kind of keep a long-standing relationship between he and David. But Samuel's older now. He dies. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him. Of course, prophets and priests and kings were national figures to the Israelites. So this would have been kind of a political office. And so when the prophet dies, then it's something that the whole nation participates in the ceremony of mourning for him. They buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. So that's how he ends up in that wilderness. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. That's a lovely name. His name was Nabal. Carmel's here with us today. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. Okay? So here are the characters. We've got Nabal, and right away you can see that this guy's got some bucks. He's pretty rich. In fact, the Bible says the man was literally heavy. That's a blank. He was heavy.
Heavy
Yes.
with money?
With money. That's the literal translation of the Hebrew that's used there.
Heavy with money.
Heavy with money.
Does that mean he was rich?
He was loaded.
Oh,
So that's it there.
Woo!
Heavy with money.
I should have known that.
Heavy with money.
Right. So that's what very wealthy means literally there in the Hebrew. But his name means fool.
Fool or fool?
Fool.
Cool.
F-O-O-L. Fool.
Okay.
Which you will see how appropriate that is in a little bit. But also recognize it's true in that time just as it is true today. You don't have to be smart to be rich. In fact, there's a lot of rich people who are very foolish, right? So those two things don't necessarily equate with one another. And we're going to see how in this man's life, he was not able to make wise decisions very often, especially in this circumstance. So, in the scriptures, especially, fool did not mean simple-minded. It just meant that you believed that there was no God. So that's the context where they would have used that term. But his name means that. So in other words, he most likely does not worship any God. His whole family, his whole clan would have named him that based on that reason. We're told that he's surly and mean, as you saw there in the text, which actually just means that he was dishonest. So the idioms that they used in the Hebrew aren't exactly the same as what we would use in English. Translators have trouble trying to figure out how best to translate what the intention of a Hebrew idiom would have been. Surly and mean is the closest they got to it. But the real purpose or the intent of it is that he was not looking out for another person to the extent that he was dishonest. So that's Nabal. That's his character. And then we hear about his wife Abigail, who is the opposite of Nabal, just about in every way. She is lovely within and without. Lovely on the outside and on the inside as well. And then, of course, we have David and his fighting heroes, which we already know a little bit about them. They come from pretty dark backgrounds. Most of those guys are in debt, or they are in trouble with the law, or they are discontented in society in some way or another, and that's why they were in the caves where David met them. But they've gathered around David, and they're doing this little job here as a mercenary force. And so verses 14 through 16, we're going to see how good a job they did protecting Nabal's sheep. Verse 14, one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us. The whole time we were out in the fields, near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. So that's kind of the testimony of the shepherds as to how well they were treated, how honestly David treated them with integrity and also protected them to the point that they felt like they were in the middle of a city that had a wall around them because of how well David's forces was protecting the sheep and the shepherds from any outside trouble, whether they be wolves or other clans coming around. But Nabal couldn't have cared less about that. So that's the conflict that we're going to see. Actually, we're going to see several different types of conflicts from these characters. First of all, you have the conflict between husband and wife. Husband and wife. You've got a husband and a wife whose temperaments are different, whose actions are very different. The way they treat others is very different. Their philosophy of life and relationships is very different from one another. You wonder how they even got together in the first place, right? This happens in life. And you see this happening between Nabal and Abigail. Then you have conflict between employer and employee that we talked about already, especially when it's sheep shearing time. So that's when things are going to escalate. We'll look at that a little bit deeper here in the next few verses. So back up into verse 4 of 1 Samuel 25. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." All right, so David is basically explaining the situation as what would have been customary for them in that time to approach the owner of the sheep and saying, "Hey, just so you're aware, this is how we did our job, and we would appreciate any support that you could give in response." And notice David didn't show up himself with hundreds of men, as he could have, and tried to pull rank, R-A-N-K. He basically agrees to take whatever Nabal decides to give him. He could have very easily showed up with a bunch of guys and said, "Look, we protected your shepherds, and nothing was stolen from them, but you better pay us. And we'll let you know when we think it's appropriate." That's not what he did. He said, "You decide what you think is appropriate, and we'll take whatever you feel like you can spare." Remember, he was loaded, heavy with money, this man. Okay? Continues into verse 9. When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who's this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered from my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" Seems like a nice guy, right? And I want you to notice how many times he uses the I and my and mine there, right? He's thinking of himself more than anything else in this decision. And so he immediately assumes the worst of David, that he's just some straggler out in the woods that broke away from his father's household and doesn't deserve anything from him, even though he'd already been aware of how he was protected by David and his men. So, hold on to your seats. This is where everything's going to break loose. Comes some anger. Get ready. All right, verse 12. David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, "Each of you strap on your sword. Mount up. We're going out there," right? So he's got this moment now where he's getting his soldiers ready. So they did, and David strapped his on as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. 400 fighting men should probably handle this rich dude.
That's the blank, right?
Right, 400 men. That should handle Nabal. Now you're going to see use of force. Basically, like, coming at a roach with a shotgun at this point. Notice this change in David since his confrontation with Saul. Now, a different situation, right? We know that David, part of his remorse with Saul was why? Why was he so upset that he gave in and cut Saul's robe? Who was Saul to David?
He had respect. He wasn't going to embarrass him.
Yeah, and what was the respect for? Was it for Saul?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about how you saluted the uniform, right? And for David, he knew that people saw Saul as the king of Israel, as God's man on earth. And so his remorse wasn't necessarily for Saul as much as it was for the fact that he was treating this venerated position with dishonor. And so David doesn't have any inkling of that with this guy Nabal, right? And so he's going after Nabal directly, and it looks like this is a little bit of overkill, his response, right? He's got all these guys on the way to take from Nabal what he's been unable to give. Which brings us to the third natural conflict here, and that is anger and murder. Anger and murder. You remember what Jesus said about it, right? If you harbor anger in your heart towards someone, it's murder, right? It's breaking the commandment of murder, because what happens in our mind we're accountable for just as much as what we would act out with our hand. And right now David's losing this battle. He's giving into a little bit of anger on the response that he's getting from Nabal. So, back at the ranch, imagine yourself in Abigail's shoes, her lovely shoes. Now, if there's conflict, which I would assume there probably is between Nabal and Abigail, isn't this the perfect opportunity for Abigail to get rid of a jerk husband? I mean, imagine, if he mistreats this guy, he may mistreat her as well, right? And so this would probably be the kind of thought that you would have if you were just thinking in the flesh as a carnal wife and not even imagining, the right and wrong of the situation. Instead, Abigail does not act that way. Verse 14, we'll see how she responds. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. And this is the part I read earlier. They did not mistreat us the whole time we were out in the fields near them. Nothing was missing. Night and day, there were a wall around us the whole time. We were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. So even Nabal's own people were like, hey, Abigail, can you help us? Because this guy's a fool. And so that's the conflicts that are taking place. Very natural conflicts that we see even in life today. And we're going to see how God comes in with supernatural solutions and how he works in this situation through people, unexpected ways with people that saves the day. So note here that the messengers come to Abigail, not Nabal. Normally, these guys would go to Nabal and say, look, you're misunderstanding who David is and what he's done for us, right? But they know they've probably already tried a few times to have this conversation with Nabal, and he wasn't hearing it because he's not seeing past himself. So they go to Abigail, potentially hoping that something good would happen, because Nabal has not been approachable. And Abigail, being his wife, knows her husband's weaknesses, and now in his weakest moment, she protects him. So she protected him. She protected him in his weakest moment.
Wow, there's a good
And so she shows grace, she shows wisdom, she shows a commitment to the covenant that she has with this man, right? Whether he deserves it or not, she chooses this path. And it says in verse 18, Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs, loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she didn't tell her husband Nabal. It's good enough for us to get maybe 6 or 7 Big Macs together in a hurry, but this woman pulls together 200 loaves of bread, ready to go. And she does it in such a way that her husband has no clue. So that's why we call it What to Feed an Angry Man. There's the formula there for the title of this chapter. So some of the best advice in life comes from a spouse. But sometimes a spouse isn't ready to hear advice. And so it's wise to keep it to yourself until the right time. Right? So Abigail would have had no success trying to do all this in front of Nabal or to convince Nabal to do any of this stuff. So she acts without his knowledge, but she acts in his favor. Acts without his knowledge and acts in his favor. By doing it, she literally saves his life. Literally.
bless her.
This man is about to be... Karen is emotionally invested in this one. So just picture David and his men just coming down this hill full tilt. He told them all to strap on their swords. In other words, they're coming with sword in hand, with angry eyes and hungry stomachs, ready to do battle against this foolish man. And here's Abigail getting everything in order for when these men show up. In verse 20, as she came riding her donkey on into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her. She met them. David had just said, it's been useless. So, in other words, as they're running down the mountain, these horses and whatnot, swords, David's just saying all this stuff out loud, before he runs into Abigail. It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He's paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. This is a man with road rage right now. Okay? And he's calling God to deal not with Nabal, but to deal with him if he doesn't deal with Nabal. You see how that's getting twisted in his mind? When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey, bowed down before David with her face to the ground. So she's already thought about what she's going to do and say, most likely. And I want you to see the tact that she uses, where 6 different times she calls herself David's servant, and then 8 times she calls David her Lord, which would have been similar to basically servant-master relationship. I'm here as your servant. This is a rich man's wife, right, who has all kinds of entitlement, and she has all kinds of servants. But she knows a bad situation when she sees it, and she's approaching David, this man who's full of rage, with some very wise tact. And this is what she says, verse 20. She comes riding a donkey into a mountain ravine. There were David and his men descending. Verse 24. She fell at his feet and said, pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man, Nabal. She's saving his life, but she doesn't like him, obviously. Okay? He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. All right, so she wasn't there to respond the first time David sent these messengers about talking about what he's done for them. It would have been a different situation, she's basically saying, had she been able to respond. This woman is a study in wisdom. She is responding to this situation, very, very tense situation, with wisdom. And she's not trying to cover up her husband's stupidity, but at the same time, she's taken responsibility on for herself, for something that really she had no control over originally. She wasn't even there when those messengers came. But she's been willing to step into this role, into this position with wisdom. So it continues, verse 26. And now, my Lord, this is her talking to David, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. You see how she's doing this? She is helping David to see the circumstance correctly. The Lord your God has kept you from taking vengeance on people that you would like to take vengeance on. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you. She knows there's a bunch of hungry men with swords in hand right there with him. So she says, please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles. No wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God, but the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. She's probably aware, seems to be referring to this cat and mouse thing between Saul and David, right? At this point, it's out there, right? David couldn't even hide in the town because everybody knew that Saul was out to get him. She's aware of who this guy is and the situation he's in, and she's using it as a way to help David check back with reality from planet anger that he's on, okay? And talking about the lives of your enemy hurled away as from the pocket of a sling. Sounds familiar with that guy, right? When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. Ain't that something? This woman, she knows how to work a man. And she's basically saying to David, do you really want to have this on your conscience when God fulfills what he's already working in your life? Is this what you want to do? Right? So he's getting him to check himself by helping him see the future and what God has planned for him and how easily this could be. Like if David had totally acted out in anger and had killed Nabal and had this bloodshed and things like that, it could have changed his trajectory with God, right? And she's calling this out. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. Pretty incredible encounter. So Abigail shows her faith by proclaiming David to be the next king who doesn't need to taint his record with a senseless murder. Most likely Nabal had no faith of this sort, but Abigail seems to have a faith in the God of David. So Abigail uses this creative approach to restore her husband's life and David's sense about the situation. So sometimes it takes creativity on the part of others to restore us, especially in times of anger. This is just good stuff for anybody who lives with some other human at any given time, where things can erupt, anger can pop up, and we sometimes go into these natural reactions, and maybe it's anger back and forth, and sometimes it just takes stepping back and creatively approaching the situation in such a way to reframe it so that it doesn't escalate. Just like Scripture talks about, when you are kind to someone who's angry or mistreating you, it's like heaping burning coals on them. It de-escalates them very quickly, just like David was de-escalated in this moment. And then she asked only for one thing in response for all of this in verse 31, and that is just simply that she would be remembered when David becomes king. Okay? You'll see how that takes place in a moment. And nothing like food to get to a man's heart. And so David showing his teachable spirit relents from his anger. She's got good advice, she confronts him in a creative way, and she brings food. Perfect, right? So this is great. And I know this is kind of like putting people, guys and girls in boxes and stuff like that, but this can sometimes work. A lot of times can work when you're dealing with situations similar to this. Okay? All right, it continues. Verse 33, David's talking to Abigail here, and he says, may you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Now he's in his right mind, right? So it's almost like he was, like I said, on planet anger, where everything was different, the atmosphere was different, and now he's come back down in his right mind, and he sees everything exactly the way she described it. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak, including most likely her kids, her sons. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. All right? So she does this incredible thing, accomplishes this almost impossible task in diverting 400 fighting hungry men from killing people in her household. And she goes home, and this is what she encounters. Verse 36. Abigail went to Nabal. He was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king, and he was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing until daybreak, right? Still, she's got her wits about her. It would be a waste of time for me to even tell you how closely you came to death right now because you're not even thinking from being so drunk. Verse 37, then in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. And his heart failed and he became like a stone. So she probably thought to herself that night that she would never know what it was like to have a husband that appreciated her. She wakes up in the morning, she tells Nabal what happened, and he reacts to the news and then next morning by literally having a stroke. It's most likely what that's describing there in Scripture, him becoming like a stone. He has a stroke. So he wakes up totally hungover, and on top of being totally hungover, dehydrated, all that, from being drunk, he gets this news and he realizes how closely he came to death, and it causes him to go over the edge physically with a stroke. Verse 38, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died.
Poor thing. Struck him with what?
Yeah, probably a stroke.
Oh, there you go.
Struck with a stroke. So when you do what is right, God takes care of the impossible things. Abigail was in an impossible situation. Nabal was seemingly an immovable object, literally, for a while. And God takes the situation into his own hands, as he always has promised he will do. And he does it on his own time. There's 10 days that pass by from this heightened emotion and all this stuff that happens, right? So it seems like daily life is back to normal again, and then like that, God finishes the situation that should have been taken care of already, right? In our minds. So then check out David's reaction when he heard that Nabal was dead. Verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise God."
Praise be to the Lord.
So there you have it. You don't want David speaking at your funeral if he doesn't like it.
Yeah.
Praise be to the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. But David's thought here is perfectly appropriate. He has given it over to God to make the situation right. And when he recognizes that God has done so, he's just praising God for it. He's kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Then David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife.
Oh my goodness.
And they lived happily ever after. The end. Okay?
Yeah.
Vengeance belongs to God, and fairy tale endings can truly happen in real life when God's involved. So here's some lessons to learn from 1 Samuel 25. When conflict arises, be wise. Wisdom will cause you to stop first most of the time in conflict and reassess situations. If you go with whatever your first reaction is to anger, most of the time that's not the wise response. So it will oftentimes cause you to stop. So be wise. Think outside of the box. Be creative. Look at it with God's eyes. Okay? Be open to the idea that you could be misseeing things. And God could see things differently from you in that situation of conflict. And if you're able to do that, then that really can make the situation better instead of escalating it into a worse situation. Number 2, take each conflict as it comes and handle them separately. Think about all the problems David's got in his life. He's already got Saul after him. This Nabal thing was just like a side trail, right? But the way real life happens is you can have, health concerns or some other major issue that's going on over here, and then you just have a bad day over here, and you don't see the difference between the two, right? And that can cause you to get into despair, when really it was just a bad trip to Walmart, okay? You're okay, you know what I mean? So those are the things where we have to make sure that when we're in these situations that life brings us, that we're able to separate the problems and know that our life isn't totally in despair. We're just dealing with a temporary situation over here. There's more major things for us to deal with over here. And to try to keep those things separate is part of wisdom as well. Every day is a new day. One conflict will follow another. You'll have good times and bad times. But in the midst of all of that, there is opportunity in every one of these situations, even separate from one another for us to trust God, develop character, and demonstrate wisdom. Third thing, whenever you realize that there is nothing you can do in a situation, wait. Pray is good. Pray and wait. You can add to that, right? But the idea there is there are some situations that you won't be able to fix in the moment, and you feel like you have to. But the reality is it's something that you need to just wait on God's timing to intervene on. So what happens when you do this, when you wait and pray, it could be a significant amount of time where the situation doesn't improve, it doesn't get any better, it doesn't change, but you change when you're waiting and praying. And as you change, the situation isn't as important as it used to be, or it's not as detrimental to you as it used to be. And so that's part of this developing character that God is working in our lives. So every morning that Abigail woke up from the night that Nabal was drunk and then had the stroke, 10 days after that, nothing changed, nothing changed, nothing changed, nothing changed. God intervened on that 10th day. Same thing is true for us. We have to just be aware that God is involved intimately in our lives and is aware of our emotions. And the best thing we can do with a lot of those, especially with anger, is to give it to God, because He can handle that. Okay? All right. Good stuff. 1 Samuel 25. A little story there with these two guys, and how much have we learned just from that one passage? It's pretty remarkable.
I guess he wasn't forewarned that you didn't learn anything.
Never
in
learned.
10 days.
Never learn, right? So you always, like in a good story, you see characters develop, right? They have an arc, as it's called, where they're not the same as they were at the beginning of the story. So David was angry, and then he realized his anger and confessed that, had integrity. Nabal was as foolish at the beginning and foolish at the end, all the way to the end. So,
So can I ask a question?
yes, ma'am.
So was it a custom back